to that would be, Dr. Peterson, what the hell is going on? And what I mean by that is, why are so many people coming to your lectures, let's say, and why did your book strike such a chord? I think the first one is the most important one. You know, generally what happens with journalists is that they're very cynical about what is happening at my lectures and also who's attending. And it's really very pejorative, demeaning, thoughtless, prejudiced, and I would say cruel all at once. Because the first assumption is that, you know, I'm talking primarily to angry, white, young men. And there certainly isn't a lot of evidence for that. I would say the average age of the people in my audience is 30s. And that's not exactly young. And then I would say, well, it's at least 30% women. And that's been increasing as the book has sold more. And, you know, the reason it was men primarily to begin with, I think, is because, well, there are many men starving for an encouraging voice. And also the fact that YouTube, which is where I picked up my primary audience to begin with, skews about 80-20 male to female in terms of its viewership, which really doesn't have anything to do with me, right? That's just a, what do you call that? That's a baseline phenomenon that has to be taken into account before you make any, before you draw any conclusions about the nature of someone's audience. But the presumption is that, you know, I'm speaking politically and in a divisive way to the people who show up to my lectures and to my talks, and that's just not true. The lectures aren't political except peripherally. I mean, I do now and then throw a critical comment or two out about the manner in which this strange alliance of postmodernism and neo-Marxism has been dominating the university, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to point out. Apart from that, the lectures almost all concentrate on psychological self-improvement, and it seems almost impossible for the media to be not cynical about that. You know, I think it's partly because almost everything that the classic media covers has to be politicized. And I was on a show, for example, called Q&A, an Australian show, which was, it's their biggest political show. It's modeled on one in the UK, which is also quite big, which I was also on a while back. And every issue immediately becomes discussed along polarized political lines. It's as if our discourse has degenerated to the point where the only possible response to a question about anything important has to be ideological, so left or right, and it has to be political. And so I think part of the problem is perhaps that the phenomenon that constitutes the attendance at my lectures doesn't fit the standard news media narrative, which is driven by journalists, I think, who had political ambitions fundamentally, or still have political ambitions of one sort or another, and who tend to view the world only through a political lens. Like, for me, the experience of my lectures is actually an unbelievably positive one, and not particularly stressful. Like, it's nowhere near as stressful as almost any interview I have with almost any journalist, because, again, things get politicized very rapidly. What happens in the lectures is that, you know, 3,000 people show up and they're happy to be there. And so it's a very welcoming atmosphere. And I get to talk to them for 70 minutes about some psychological problem, I would say, often associated with one of the chapters in my book, like what it means to, what a human competence hierarchy might look like, say, if I was talking about chapter 1, because we do organize hierarchies. Human beings naturally organize hierarchies like other animals do, but we tend to organize hierarchies to achieve valuable goals, you know, and valuable in that they're goals that people assume would be usefully achieved to decrease the some amount of suffering in the world, or maybe to bring happiness to people, or a bit of luxury, or something, generally something of at least limited use, and often far more than limited. And I talk to people about the fact that the best way to make progress in a human hierarchy has nothing to do with power, but everything to do with reciprocity